What would you do if the horizon stopped moving? If the ocean became an unbroken circle of blue that refused to give you direction, mercy, or escape? Imagine waking up each day not knowing if it will be your last, measuring time not by clocks, but by hunger, thirst, and the slow erosion of hope. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a metaphor. This is the true story of a man who disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean and remained there for 76 days, alone, exposed, and presumed dead, drifting farther from civilization with every sunrise, while the world went on without him. On a cold February morning in 1982, the Atlantic Ocean did not look especially dangerous. The waves were moderate, the sky was clear, and there was nothing in the air to suggest that the sea was about to erase a man from the map. Stephen Callahan was an experienced sailor, a man who trusted the ocean not because he underestimated it, but because he believed he understood it. He had crossed oceans before, lived by the rhythms of wind and tide, and designed boats for a living. Sailing was not a hobby for him. It was an identity. That sense of confidence, earned through years of experience, would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Callahan was sailing solo from the Canary Islands toward the Caribbean aboard his small sailboat, the Napoleon Solo. Alone at sea, days away from any shipping lanes, he followed a routine shaped by discipline and calm. The boat was his entire world, its creaks and movements familiar enough to feel almost alive. At night, he slept lightly, always aware that the ocean never truly rests. Somewhere in the darkness, without warning, that trust was shattered. It happened while he was asleep. A sudden, violent impact threw him awake. The sound was not subtle, not gradual, but explosive, as if the ocean itself had struck the hull with intent. A whale, massive and unseen, had collided with the boat. In seconds, water began pouring in. The damage was catastrophic. This was not a leak that could be patched, not a problem that could be managed. The sea was taking the boat back. Callahan moved on instinct. He grabbed his emergency gear, activated his life raft, and watched as the vessel he depended on for survival slipped beneath the surface. There was no dramatic farewell, no time to process what he was losing. One moment he had a boat. The next he had nothing but a small inflatable raft, a few survival supplies, and an ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. As the Napoleon Solo disappeared, something else vanished with it, the illusion of control. Callahan was now adrift, not metaphorically, but literally, a single human body floating on one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The raft was barely larger than a bathtub. It offered no shelter from the sun, little protection from storms, and no engine to take him anywhere. The ocean would decide where he went. At first, hope came from routine. He took inventory of his supplies with the careful precision of someone trying not to panic. A solar still to collect drinking water, a spear gun for fishing, a small knife, emergency flares, enough food to last a short time if rationed carefully. On paper, survival seemed possible. In reality, it was already slipping away. Days passed, then weeks. The sun became his greatest enemy. During the day, it burned his skin, blistered his lips, and drained his strength. At night, the temperature dropped, leaving him shivering and exposed. Salt water soaked into every cut, every sore, turning minor injuries into constant sources of pain. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by fear, hunger, and the relentless motion of the sea. Psychologically, the isolation was as dangerous as dehydration. There were no voices, no signs of life beyond the occasional bird or fish. The silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive. Callahan began to talk to himself, not out of madness, but necessity. Human beings are not designed to exist without connection, and the ocean offered none. Fishing became a daily struggle for survival. He learned to read the water, to spot the subtle shadows that meant life beneath the surface. When he caught fish, it was not a victory so much as a temporary delay of death. He ate them raw, tearing flesh with his teeth, forcing his body to accept what his mind resisted. Hunger strips away dignity quickly. Water was the most precious resource. The solar still produced only small amounts, barely enough to keep him alive. Every drop was rationed, measured, cherished. Dehydration crept in slowly, bringing hallucinations, weakness, and confusion. There were moments when he considered drinking seawater, fully aware that it would only hasten the end. Survival became a series of decisions where every option carried consequences. Storms came without warning. Waves slammed into the raft, threatening to flip it, to tear it apart. During these moments, Callahan was certain he would die. There was no heroism in those hours, no inspiring clarity, only fear and endurance. He clung to the raft and waited, because waiting was the only thing he could do. As days turned into weeks, the human body began to fail in predictable ways. Weight loss became extreme. Muscles weakened. Infections festered. Salt sores covered his skin. His face became unrecognizable, hollowed and burned by the sun. And yet, something inside him refused to let go. Not optimism, not blind hope, but a stubborn, almost mechanical determination to stay alive one more day. Ships passed him. He saw them on the horizon, close enough to recognize as salvation, too far to reach. He screamed. He waved. He fired flares. Nothing. Either they did not see him, or they chose not to look closely enough. Each missed opportunity carved deeper into his psyche. Being unseen is a special kind of torture. At one point, he drifted into shipping lanes. Logic suggested rescue was imminent. Reality disagreed. Days passed with no help. The ocean, vast and indifferent, continued to carry him westward. Time lost meaning. He stopped counting days and began counting survivals, sunrise to sunrise, breath to breath. What kept him alive was not just instinct, but adaptation. He learned to use the ocean rather than fight it. He followed birds, understanding that they led toward land. He collected rainwater with desperate gratitude. He accepted the reality of his situation without surrendering to it. This balance between acceptance and resistance is often where survival lives. After more than 2 months adrift, his body was failing. He was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and exhausted. Death was no longer a dramatic possibility. It was a quiet, approaching certainty. And then one morning, the color of the water changed. The birds became more frequent. The smell of land, faint but undeniable, reached him. On the 76th day, Callahan drifted into the waters near Guadeloupe. Fishermen spotted the raft, barely recognizable as a vessel carrying a living person. When they pulled him from the ocean, he weighed barely more than a child. His skin was burned dark, his eyes sunken, his body covered in wounds. But he was alive. Doctors later confirmed what seemed impossible. He should not have survived. The human body is not designed to endure that level of exposure, deprivation, and isolation. And yet he did. Not because he was stronger than others, but because he adapted, endured, and refused to surrender when surrender would have been easier. Stephen Callahan's survival was not a miracle in the cinematic sense. There were no divine interventions, no sudden rescues at the last second. It was a slow, grinding victory earned through suffering. His story forces an uncomfortable question. How much can a human being endure before breaking? And what happens when they don't? Today, his experience is studied by survival experts, sailors, and psychologists alike. Not as inspiration alone, but as evidence of the thin line between life and death. The ocean did not choose to spare him. It simply did not finish the job. The rest was up to him. So the question remains, if you were alone, unseen, and slowly disappearing from the world, would you keep fighting for one more day, knowing no one might ever come? Or would you let the silence win?